Okay, so today we'll be dealing with one of the important essay topics from neuroanatomy, that is internal capsule. So internal capsule can be asked as an essay, like long essay, or it can be asked as a short essay also. Like the different parts of the subheadings of internal capsule can be asked as separate short essays. Like the blood supply, that is the most important part, can be asked as a separate short essay. Okay, the relations and all, that is also parts of internal capsule. They can all be asked. So I would recommend you watching this video to help in your revision. So you can watch it as at like 1.5x or 2x, and open your neuroanatomy textbook, whichever you refer. I have referred Vishram Singh in this. You can refer whatever you want and like open side by side and highlight as you listen. Only then it might help you to some extent, because otherwise, unless you have just revised this topic, you might not remember it. So there won't be any point in just listening. Okay, so coming to the definition, and like, okay, so just telling you, if they have given you about like write about internal capsule, no sub questions are given. You have to write it under certain subheading. So you have to define it first. You have to talk about the boundaries, the relations, the fibers which pass through it, and then you have to talk about the arterial supply and the clinical correlation. Okay, that is how you will form the structure for the essay. Otherwise, mostly they'll give the sub question, so you can just answer the sub questions also. Okay, so let's define what internal capsule is. Internal capsule is basically a compact bundle of projections that is between the thalamus and the head of the caudate nucleus, medially, and lentiform nucleus laterally. Okay, so let me zoom in over here. You can see over here, the central part over here in between, this is the internal capsule. Okay, so this part over here, these both, this is the head of the caudate nucleus and this is the thalamus, and both of them form the medial relation. And this part over here, this is the lentiform nucleus, and that is the lateral relation for the internal capsule. Okay, so fibers arising from various parts, maybe it is arising from the cortex, maybe it is arising from the thalamus, they will pass through this internal capsule and they will go to wherever they are supposed to go. Okay, so it just acts as a relay junction. Okay, so lentiform nucleus, caudate nucleus, all that you must be knowing about, like the basal ganglia and stuff. That is basically the caudate nucleus and the lentiform nucleus. Lentiform nucleus, again, as you know, there would be two separate parts under lentiform nucleus itself. The internal part, it is the pallidum, and the outside part, it is the putamen. Okay, and this is the not the caudate nucleus. Okay, head of the caudate nucleus. Tail of the caudate nucleus will be somewhere over here. Okay, so it is mainly responsible for the sensory and the motor innervation of the opposite side of the body, which we will talk in more detail when we come to the clinical correlation. Okay, so what is the shape? It is V-shaped, as you can clearly see from the diagram over here. This shape, it looks like a V, so it is a V. Um, so what are the relations? From this diagram only you can say the medial, as I said earlier also, but from this diagram you can see this is a 2D representation, mind you. You should be knowing that this is a 3D structure, so there are parts of it which extends behind and below also. Okay, so this is the head of the caudate nucleus over here. This is the thalamus, this is the lentiform nucleus, and this is the internal capsule. Okay, so the internal capsule, where you can see this part till the bend, this part is the anterior limb. The bend, this is known as the genu, and from the bend to over here, this is the posterior limb. Okay, so there is also a part of this behind the lentiform nucleus, which is the retrolentiform part, and another part which is not seen in this figure is the sublentiform part. Okay, so these five parts are the constituents of the internal capsule. Okay, they are the components or the parts of the internal capsule. So coming to what are the fibers which pass through this internal capsule. So internal capsule serves as a relay junction. As I said, different fibers arising from different parts pass through this internal capsule. So internal capsule is basically a point of high neuron density. Okay, a lot of nerve fibers are passing through this small area of an internal capsule. So even a small lesion in this internal capsule can cause a widespread paralysis of the body, depending on which part of the which depending on which nerves are affected. But all the nerves are concentrated so together in this internal capsule. So even like a small lesion can cause the paralysis, maybe half-sided paralysis like hemiplegia, or lower body paralysis like paraplegia or something, eh, depending on whatever structures are involved. So let's come to what the constituent fibers are. So there are two types of fibers, motor and sensory. Okay, so under motor also we have three types of fibers. You can see over here it is the corticopontine, pyramidal and the extrapyramidal fibers. Okay, um, so what are the corticopontine fibers? So the corticopontine fibers are basically the fibers which arise from the cerebral cortex, and they will form uh, like a projection of fibers, and they will go to different parts of the uh, cerebral cortex itself, like through the internal capsule. Okay, they will pass from the pons, and they will go to the different parts of the cerebral cortex. So the first part, which is the frontopontine, that is the like single most largest group of fibers in this corticopontine. So it forms like mainly two-third of the fibers are just frontopontine itself. Then the others are paritopontine, temporopontine, occipitopontine, etc. Okay, so if you see this figure over here, all the pink parts over this parts over here, no, frontopontine, not the pink parts, the blue parts, the frontopontine part, it passes through the anterior limb, genu, as well as the posterior limb. Okay, so these dots which you see over here, they are the frontopontine fibers. And then you can see the paritopontine, occipitopontine, they pass through the retrolentiform part. They are over here in the figure, you can see over here. Okay, uh, like the other fibers are also there, like temporopontine and all. The temporopontine will go through the sublentiform part. Okay, so these fibers are just widely distributed in the internal capsule, the frontopontine being the single most widely distributed one, constituting two-thirds of the fibers. Okay, you can remember that much. And then coming to the next set of fibers, the pyramidal fibers. Okay, so the pyramidal fibers, they are the okay, these are all motor fibers. Okay, I hope you remember that there are two parts in this pyramidal fiber itself. So the first part is the corticonuclear, and the second part is the corticospinal one. Okay, so what are these? The corticonuclear fibers, they are the ones which will innervate the head and neck. Okay, the corticonuclear ones are the one. Okay, I'll open this diagram over here. They will innervate the head and neck, and the corticospinal will innervate the rest of the part, being the upper limb, trunk and the lower limb. Okay, so you can see the upper limb, trunk and the lower limb are in the same order as the diagram. This part for the upper limb, this part for the trunk, and this part for the lower limb. Okay, so these fibers, they are basically motor fibers. They'll supply the structures over there in whichever region they are supplying, and they'll help in the movement of that region. Okay, so other than these two fibers of the motor system which control the voluntary movements, there are other uh, fibers also which will control the involuntary movements. So those structures which control the involuntary movements are the extrapyramidal fibers. Okay, so the extrapyramidal fibers also, you know about the basal ganglia and all, they you have studied about the in the you might have drawn these things in the cross section of the brainstem, the red nucleus, and the substantia nigra, corpus, all those stuff, they are in the extrapyramidal fibers. Okay, so these structures, they are usually innovating they are usually helpful in the involuntary movements. As you know, with the Parkinson's disease, lesion in substantia nigra causes Parkinson's disease, right? So these are the extrapyramidal fibers also. Okay, so coming to the next type of fibers, which is the sensory fibers. Okay, these sensory fibers also pass through this. So sensory fibers are mainly thalamic radiations. So thalamic radiations can either be thalamocortical or corticothalamic. Okay, thalamocortical are the ones which arise from the thalamus to the cortex. Corticothalamic are the ones from the cortex to the thalamus, but mostly we'll talk about the thalamocortical ones only. So there are four types of radiations in thalamic radiations itself: the anterior, superior, posterior and inferior. So you can see the diagram over here. This is the thalamus. The one over here, this is the superior radiation, inferior radiation, anterior radiation and posterior radiation. Okay, so the anterior radiation, as you can see, it will pass through the anterior limb. The superior radiation will pass through the posterior limb. The posterior radiation will pass through the sublentiform part of the internal capsule, and the inferior radiation, we can the diagram, in the diagram we cannot see visualize it, but visualize it like, sublentiform part. Through the sublentiform part, the inferior thalamic radiation will go, because it is going downward, right? Okay. So this one diagram, it is a very important diagram for the relations, for understanding the relations, and you must learn it. So as we can see, it summarizes all the relations. Okay, so basically in the anterior thalamic radiations, posterior thalamic, all these structures, they carry certain functions. Okay, so I have not written the functions per se individually, but I'll just say about it. Okay, you will see about it in the diagram also later on. So the anterior thalamic radiations, they will connect the thalamus to the frontal lobe or the frontal cortex. Okay, and the superior thalamic radiations, they will connect it with the frontal and the parietal lobe, and the posterior, again it will connect it with the posterior or the occipital lobe, where the visual cortex will be there. Okay, visual cortex will be there over here. And the inferior one will pass through the sublentiform, through the medial geniculate body, and it will reach where? It will reach the auditory cortex, so it will assist in the hearing. Here the superior one I have not written over here, parietal. Okay, so this one diagram over here, this is very important, so remember the relations through this. So I'll see the um, thalamic radiations first. Okay, so this one over here, this is thalamic radiations. For this, we can see this is the anterior radiations, and then we can see the posterior radiations is the one which we can see over here. This posterior radiations is passing through the uh, sublentiform part, and it is reaching the visual cortex. So do you remember the Brodmann's area for the visual cortex? It is area number 17. Okay, just as a recap for your physiology. And the association areas are 18 and 19. Okay, so 17, 18 and 19 basically associated with visual cortex. And uh, there is again the retrolentiform part, through which the inferior thalamic radiations will go. They are known as the auditory radiations. They will reach the auditory cortex, which is the Heschel's gyrus, and it will reach the primary auditory cortex in the temporal lobe. Okay, so do you remember what is the Brodmann's auditory cortex area? It is area number 41 and 42. Okay, however the association area is 22. Okay, not like similar to the one we saw in visual. Again, this is just an additional information for your physiology. Okay, then coming to the next one, which is the you can see the other structures also over here. They are beautifully represented over here. This is the corticonuclear fibers in the genu, and then in the posterior limb we can see the corticospinal for the upper limb, trunk, and the lower limb also in the order. This is the corticorubral one, which corticorubral is from the cortex to the red nucleus. Okay, rubral, red, like that. That is the extrapyramidal fibers. They are also there in the posterior limb itself. Okay, this is just a brief diagram, so I think you have understood the relations from this. The dot over here, these which you see over here, that is the uh, corticopontine fibers, which I said earlier. The corticopontine one, they are distributed widely over here, no, so that they are just uh, drawn it as dots and not represented it. The anterior the frontopontine ones are distributed over here in the anterior limb genu, and the posterior limb as well. The parietopontine, the temporopontine, all that are represented by that. Okay, so I think you have oh yeah, okay, I'm not said about this now over here. The medial geniculate body and the lateral geniculate body also you have to draw in this diagram, because the auditory radiations will pass through the medial geniculate body, and the optic radiations will pass through the lateral geniculate body. I think you have some code or something for remembering this in physiology. I'm just briefly describing it. Okay, so the next part. Okay, so there is the summarizing table also over here, summarizing the fibers which pass through each part. I think this would be easy now. Anterior limb, from the anterior limb we can see the frontopontine will be there. In the genu also frontopontine will be there. Posterior limb also frontopontine will be there. You can see the blue one over here. This was the frontopontine. So you can see it is distributed throughout the course of the internal capsule. Okay. Then we can see the other fibers. So wait a second. Okay, so the other in the genu we can see motor fibers are the corticonuclear fibers for the head and neck, and we can also see the superior thalamic radiations. I said superior thalamic passes through the genu and the anterior part, and the posterior limb mainly. Okay. The anterior limb, through the anterior limb, the sensory fibers passing are the anterior thalamic radiations. Then coming to the posterior limb, the motor fibers, the corticospinal, remember the ones being the upper limb, trunk, and the middle and the lower limb in the order as given. Okay. Then you also have the corticorubral fibers, which is the extrapyramidal fibers, that is also there in the posterior limb itself. You remember the diagram from here? And anterior, this is the corticonuclear, this is the corticospinal, and this is the one for the lower limb, this is the extrapyramidal one. Okay, so coming to the next one, which is the retrolentiform part. Through the retrolentiform part, we can see that the parietopontine and the occipitopontine fibers are the ones which are passing, and the sensory fibers passing are the posterior thalamic radiations. The optic radiations, as I said, passing to the optic cortex, which is there in the occipital lobe, so it should go backward. So similarly, it is the posterior thalamic radiations going to the retro means backward. Sublentiform part, sub means what? Below parietopontine, and temporopontine is the one which is mainly there, and the inferior thalamic. So you can just correlate. Sub means basically below means what? Temporal lobe is below, and inferior means also below. So inferior thalamic radiations, which is again going to the temporal lobe itself. Okay, auditory radiations. So that is a summary of this thing. Okay, so coming to the single most important point of this thing. Okay, so this arterial supply, this is very important. Wait a second. Okay, so arterial supply is very important. So I have drawn this diagram. I think it's not very good, but okay, you can make do. You can see there are parts: anterior limb, genu, posterior limb, sublentiform, and retrolentiform. So these I have just made different colors for each region of the internal capsule, so that you can understand it better. So first we have to see for the arterial supply, you need to know what the arteries are. Okay, so I hope you remember the circle of Willis. If you do remember the circle of Willis, it's good. Otherwise, I recommend that you revise the circle of Willis, because this is the internal carotid artery over here. This one, how do I highlight? Okay, this one is the internal carotid artery. Okay, and the internal carotid artery, the main two branches, I hope you know, are the middle carotid artery and the anterior cerebral artery. If you recollect the circle of Willis, this is the anterior communicating artery. There would be another anterior cerebral artery from here. There would be another posterior communicating artery which will communicate with the posterior cerebral one over here. That will form the circle of Willis. I hope you remember that part. So if you remember that, this is going to be easy. Okay, so this is the internal carotid artery. Okay, so from the internal carotid artery directly there is a branch. It is supplying which region? It is supplying the genu. I have given green color for the genu. Okay, should I highlight? Okay, it's fine. And then what? From the middle cerebral artery. The middle cerebral artery gives many branches. There are medial and lateral striate branches. These are the parts which supply the posterior limb. Okay, the blue ones which we can see over here. And then there is the anterior cerebral artery, which will supply the anterior limb. Okay, so this artery from the anterior cerebral artery, it has a special name, so you always have to remember named arteries. Okay, so this one takes a recurrent course, so it is known as the recurrent artery of Hubner. Okay, so you will see in the anatomical correlations, the thing is, this artery is the one which is, if it is involved, the structure in the anterior limb will be involved. Okay, Then coming to the next part, which is the sublentiform part, supplying the sublentiform part, there are arteries arising from two branches. So we can see there is the anterior choroidal artery over here, and there is also the posterior cerebral artery over here. Both of them are supplying the sublentiform part. Okay. Some branches from the posterior cerebral is also supplying the lentiform, retrolentiform part. Okay. So that is basically the summary of the arterial supply. So why would you study about the arterial supply? Why is it so important? Why is it repeatedly asked? So I think it is very important because in later on stages when you start study medicine and all, there is something called the localization of the stroke. Okay, I've written it in the clinical application. If you are asked about what is the clinical application of this internal capsule or the arterial supply of the internal capsule, it is basically for stroke localization. So I hope you know what is a stroke. Stroke is basically a focal neurological deficit which or a deficit in any part of the brain, which brain or any part of the nerve system, which occurs due to, you know, uh, interruption of the blood supply to that region. So that interruption may be due to some clot in the artery, it can be due to rupture of some artery or some aneurysm, something like that. So basically, um, each part of this each one artery or one part of an artery is assigned to supply a particular part of the brain. Okay, so if there is an interruption in that blood supply, you know that that region has been affected. Okay, so based on if a patient comes with a stroke, okay, so you can see what the symptoms, what the presenting symptoms are. And if you see that there are symptoms of the upper limb, trunk and the lower limb mainly, you'll know that the posterior limb is the one affected. And if you know that the posterior limb is the one affected, you will know that the arterial supply of the posterior limb is from the middle cerebral artery. So the middle cerebral artery is the one which is affected. Okay, so that is how you will localize the stroke. Again, if you see there are any auditory, or hearing problems associated, sudden hearing problems, or any optic problems associated along with other hemiplegia or paraplegia or something like that, you will know that, if the auditory radiations are affected, it might be problem, the retrolentiform part might be affected in the lesion. So maybe there is some kind of uh, block or some kind of something is in the posterior cerebral artery. You can localize it based on the symptoms that follow. It's not as easy as I say. There are a lot of etiologies for a stroke, but then it assists, you can if you can just make a general idea of where the stroke might be. That is the clinical correlation of this. Okay. Yeah, so I think that is, okay, I forgot one important point was, so the middle and the me, uh, the medial and the lateral striate branches, no, over here I talked about from the middle cerebral artery. It is a named artery. I'm not written over here, so I'll write it. It's the Charcot's artery of hemorrhage. Okay, why is it called as the Charcot's artery of hemorrhage? Is because it is the one which is most commonly involved in stroke. So like, you see it is supplying the posterior limb where the upper limb, trunk and the lower limb fibers are there. So any small lesion over here, you will get a hemiplegia, you might get a paraplegia, something like that. So I said in if I don't remember if I said it in the start, the fibers are very compactly placed in the internal capsule. So even if there is a small lesion, it will affect a wide area. See, usually nerves are distributed throughout the body, but if it is passing through a common junction, any lesion in that junction will cause the damage to region affecting all those the nerves supplying all those regions. Okay, so that is the importance of the internal capsule. Okay, so I think that's it for the lecture. I think just you can go. I don't know if I should summarize it or something. We talked about what the internal capsule was. We talked about the shape, the boundaries. We talked about what the parts of the internal capsule are, the 5 parts. Remember, I hope you remember it. Then we talked about what the constituent fibers are, the motor and the sensory. The motor being corticopontine, pyramidal, and extrapyramidal. Also, don't forget the extrapyramidal part. Then we talked about how frontopontine was the single most, abundant, constituting 2/3 of the corticopontine fibers distributed throughout, and then the other fibers also. Then we talked about the corticonuclear, which was supplying the head and neck, and the corticospinal ones, which was supplying the upper limb, trunk, and the lower limb. Okay, we saw it in the diagram over here. There are also the extrapyramidal ones, like the ones with the red nucleus, substantia nigra, etc. I saw it in the diagram over here. It is also there in the posterior limb. Okay, then we talked about the sensory fibers, thalamic radiations, the four types of thalamic radiations. Each part it goes to. Then we summarize the parts of the internal capsule, the fibers going through each part. Then we talked about the arterial supply. Mainly it is from the internal carotid artery, that is the main thing, and the internal carotid artery and the posterior cerebral artery, they are the main things, the branches arising from this. The middle cerebral artery, the anterior cerebral artery, the anterior choroidal artery, the posterior communicating one, which posterior communicate from the posterior communicating also there are some branches arising. I have not highlighted them, but because it's not there in the diagram in your textbook, but anyway there are branches arising from the posterior communicating. There is the posterior cerebral artery also. So these are the ones which are supplying each part, being the anterior limb, genu, posterior limb, sublentiform, and the retrolentiform. We talked about the clinical application being the stroke localization. In the stroke localization, you can talk about the recurrent artery of Hubner. You can talk about the Charcot's artery of hemorrhage, how if it is affected, the upper limb, trunk, lower limb are all affected. You can talk, you can just fill up about that. I think you can describe it in more detail. Okay, so I think that's it. Thank you for listening. I hope you gained something from this lecture. Okay, all the best for your university exams. Bye.